Welcome to a journey into one of the darkest stories ever whispered through the Tennessee hills. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from and what time it is. As you listen, we're curious to see just how far and wide these accounts reach. It was 1882, a time when the railroads and telegraph wires were cutting through the wilderness, but the hills of eastern Tennessee still held secrets the modern world couldn't quite touch. In the quiet settlement of Hollow Creek, under the shadow of the Great Smoky Mountains, stood the Blackwood Estate, once a grand two-story home with a wraparound porch and proud cupola now fading into decay after the death of Franklin Blackwood, a timber merchant whose lumber helped build the new rail lines running through the Cumberland Gap. His widow, Eliza Blackwood, still lived there, though she had become distant and withdrawn since her husband's passing. That October, local farmers began reporting strange losses among their livestock. Not whole animals, but pieces of them. Cows were found with sections cleanly removed, hogs stripped of their choicest cuts, and lambs neatly sliced open with unnerving precision. People blamed wolves or mountain lions at first, but veteran hunters like Jedediah Holt swore no predator in those parts made cuts like that. "Been hunting these mountains near 40 years, his statement read, "and never seen no beast that butchers its kill like it's prepping for Sunday dinner." The Hollow Creek Gazette printed a short note blaming unusual predator activity, urging farmers to secure their pens. But what the paper didn't print, what Sheriff Thomas Dillard recorded in his personal journal, was that the strange attacks formed a circle around the Blackwood property. None came from the other side of Hollow Creek. Sheriff Dillard's journal, later found during courthouse renovations in 1963, describes his visit to the estate on November 4th. He noted the widow seemed remarkably healthy for a grieving woman, and that the entire house carried a faint scent of cured meat, though there was no smokehouse anywhere on the grounds. He wrote that every window on the second floor was boarded from inside. Eliza claimed it was to protect her furniture from sunlight, and that she'd sealed off the back kitchen with a heavy new door, an odd choice for a woman living alone. Even more curious, her pantry was overflowing with supplies fit for a family of 10, though she claimed to expect no visitors and had dismissed her servant Jeremiah Simmons months before. Records show Simmons had worked for the family for 7 years, and his departure was abrupt. In a letter to his sister, now archived in the Tennessee Historical Society, he mentioned that Mrs. Blackwood had asked him to fetch certain private items he refused to name, things he said his Christian conscience wouldn't allow. The letter ended with a strange note: "If anyone asks, say I've gone west. Truth is, I'll stay in Knoxville for a while." By December, the livestock attacks stopped. Around the same time, stagecoach drivers began reporting an unusual number of deliveries to the Blackwood home. The local store ledgers show Eliza ordering large amounts of salt potassium nitrate and canning jars. Despite the cold winter, the shopkeeper Harold Jenkins wrote that her complexion seemed unnaturally robust, as if she thrived in the chill. He also noted she began paying extra for him to quietly procure certain supplies, specialized knives from Chattanooga, oddly sized glass jars, and chemicals used for preserving anatomical specimens, the kind only found through medical contacts in Nashville. December brought the first disappearance that would eventually tie directly to the Blackwood case. Edward Morgan, a traveling salesman, who'd been making seasonal rounds through the Tennessee Hill communities for over a decade, never arrived at his scheduled stop in Johnson City. According to stagecoach records, Morgan had stepped off at Hollow Creek on December 12th, planning to spend 2 days visiting customers before moving on. The last confirmed sighting came from Sophia Williams, who ran a small boarding house in town. She recalled that Morgan mentioned having a promising appointment with the widow on the hill before leaving on the morning of December 13th. When he didn't return that night, Mrs. Williams assumed he'd found lodging at one of the nearby farms. But when his luggage went unclaimed by December 15th, she reported his disappearance to Sheriff Dillard. A search of the area turned up only his sample case discovered abandoned near the stream that bordered the eastern edge of the Blackwood property. When questioned, Mrs. Blackwood admitted Morgan had visited, but insisted he'd left before sundown, saying he intended to call on the Hargrove farm 3 miles away. Ezekiel Hargrove, however, denied ever seeing a salesman. The following month, in January 1883, local physician Dr. Marcus Walsh was summoned to the Blackwood estate for what Mrs. Blackwood described as a bout of indigestion. His medical notes found decades later among papers donated to the University of Tennessee painted a peculiar picture. The widow's quarters were spotless, but oddly arranged with furniture positioned to block certain doors and cold drafts seeping from what should have been solid walls. Though she claimed discomfort, Walsh noted she appeared remarkably healthy, her complexion glowing, her body full, and her strength unusual for a woman her age, especially one in mourning. What disturbed him most, however, were the sounds. Twice during his visit, he heard faint movement from the back of the house, followed by a metallic clinking like cookware or chains. When he asked if someone else was present, Mrs. Blackwood grew tense, dismissing it as the old timbers settling in winter's chill before briskly changing the subject. That same January brought a severe cold snap across eastern Tennessee, freezing the creek and stranding travelers in Hollow Creek. Stagecoach logs record 2 passengers left behind when the roads iced over James Wilson, a jewelry merchant from Richmond, and Maria Collins, a young woman en route to Knoxville to begin work as a governess. With Sophia Williams's boarding house already full, Miss Collins was taken in by Reverend Hollister's wife, while Wilson accepted an invitation to stay at the fine house on the hill, almost certainly the Blackwood estate. When the weather cleared days later, Wilson boarded the next coach out, but Miss Collins later remarked to her hosts that she found it strange he had left without the small leather valise he had guarded so carefully throughout their trip. That forgotten detail would gain chilling significance months later. The quiet unease surrounding Hollow Creek turned darker on February 17, 1883, when a peddler named Samuel Crawford vanished along his route. Witnesses told Sheriff Dillard that Crawford had spoken of calling on the widow, believing she might be interested in his exotic stock of herbs and compounds from New Orleans remedies, said to preserve youth and vitality. Crawford was hard to miss anywhere he went. His bright clothes, loud laugh, and jeweled walking stick carved with serpents made him a familiar sight across the Tennessee hills. So when he failed to appear in Johnson City on February 20th, as he had every month for years, people noticed. Sheriff Dillard followed his route and stopped by the Blackwood estate after learning Crawford had planned to call on the widow. Mrs. Blackwood confirmed his visit, but claimed he'd left before sundown, heading toward the next settlement. During their conversation, the sheriff noted a dull rhythmic thumping somewhere deep in the house. When he asked about it, Mrs. Blackwood explained it away as frozen pipes reacting to the winter cold. But what unsettled him most came as he turned to leave. Leaning against the back door was Crawford's unmistakable walking stick, its serpents glinting faintly in the light. When he asked, she said the peddler had forgotten it and would collect it on his next visit. Dillard's instincts told him something was wrong, but with no evidence of a crime, all he could do was file his suspicions and send word to nearby sheriffs. None ever reported seeing Crawford again. By March, the talk around Hollow Creek had shifted from pity to unease. The widow on the hill, once the quiet object of sympathy, had become the center of whispered rumors that stopped the moment a stranger entered the room. She no longer attended church, excusing her absence in a letter to Reverend Hollister, saying she had adopted a private devotional practice more fitting for a contemplative widow. The Reverend kept the letter, and later investigators would notice its handwriting was strikingly different from her earlier notes, a detail dismissed at the time as the effect of illness or fatigue. Then came the disappearance of 19-year-old Abigail Thurman, a laundress who occasionally worked in Hollow Creek homes. Her mother told the sheriff Abigail had been thrilled to have found steady employment at the Blackwood estate, saying the widow had offered generous pay for light chores and special household projects. She left on March 15th with her small valise and never returned. When she missed her younger brother's birthday a week later, her mother raised the alarm. Mrs. Blackwood told Sheriff Dillard that Abigail had worked only 3 days before leaving for a better opportunity in Knoxville. She even produced a note neatly written and politely worded thanking her for the employment. The sheriff accepted it, but Abigail's mother insisted her daughter could barely write her own name, much less compose a letter like that. The sheriff's doubts deepened, but again without proof, he could do nothing. Then in April, the widow's activities took a curious turn. Land deeds filed that month show she began buying up the properties around her estate, the abandoned Miller farm to the north, and 2 smaller tracts to the east. By the end of the month, she had effectively walled herself off from the rest of Hollow Creek. What startled observers most wasn't her isolation, but the money. Bank records revealed that Franklin Blackwood had died, nearly broke his timber business, drowning in debt. Yet within months, Eliza was paying for land in cash, offering prices well above market value. Later investigators would question how she'd suddenly come into so much money, though at the time people assumed it was from hidden savings or distant family inheritances. Around the same time, telegraph logs from Johnson City show that the widow began exchanging frequent messages with contacts in Knoxville, Atlanta, and even New Orleans. None of the content was preserved, but the pattern suggested urgent correspondence, and soon after, Hollow Creek's small bank recorded deposits into a new account under her name, with funds arriving by draft from multiple southern cities. Then came May, bringing an early suffocating heat, and with it a smell. Farmers downwind began complaining to Sheriff Dillard about a strange odor drifting from the Blackwood estate. One man described it as like a smokehouse that's gone wrong, another as sweet and rotten at the same time. But it was Wilbur Tanner's description that lingered like the battlefield after 3 days in the sun. According to county records, Sheriff Dillard didn't return to Hollow Creek until nearly a week after the first complaints about the odor, his delay caused by a law enforcement conference in Nashville. That week would prove crucial. Several townsfolk later reported strange activity around the Blackwood estate during his absence. They described wagons coming and going, late at night loaded with heavy crates and barrels. Ezra Jenkins, the general storekeeper's son, swore he saw the widow herself overseeing the work wearing what looked like a butcher's apron, streaked with something dark that gleamed in the moonlight. When Dillard finally arrived on May 24th, he found the house locked tight and silent. No answer came to his knocking. Circling the property, he discovered a newly built root cellar behind the main house. The door was fitted with an odd, intricate lock, unlike anything he'd seen before. What truly alarmed him was the trail of dark, viscous fluid leaking from beneath the cellar door, soaking into the dirt and trickling toward the stream that bordered the property. With no legal grounds to break in, Dillard rode back to town to request a warrant. The justice of the peace refused, unwilling to issue one, against a well-regarded widow based solely on foul smells and a locked cellar. So Dillard began methodically gathering evidence, interviewing neighbors, reviewing missing persons reports, and mapping the strange disappearances that seemed to circle the Blackwood land. But before he could act, fate intervened. On the night of June 9, 1883, fire erupted at the Blackwood estate. By the time Hollow Creek's volunteer brigade arrived, the house was engulfed flames clawing at the night sky. No one saw Mrs. Blackwood escape, and when the embers cooled, no body was found. But what the fire uncovered was worse than any grave. Witnesses reported several small explosions as the blaze reached the rear of the property. Bursts caused investigators later determined by jars of volatile preserving chemicals. The collapsing heat exposed the root cellar, its roof caving in to reveal what had been hidden below. Fire Captain Elijah Monroe's sworn statement, dated June 10, 1883, described what they saw. "What we found defied Christian understanding and shall haunt my dreams until the Lord calls me home." Inside were large ceramic vessels, some shattered by the fire, others intact, each containing preserved human remains. Not full bodies, but parts, limbs neatly separated at the joints, torsos stripped of arms and legs, all prepared with surgical precision, far beyond the work of any local butcher. Even worse, several jars bore handwritten labels, with names recognized from missing persons reports, Morgan Dex Crawford. Others showed only initials or first letters, silent markers of people whose absence no one had noticed. In the days that followed, a further search revealed a hidden chamber beneath the main house, accessible through a disguised door in the pantry. Sheltered by stone, much of its contents survived the flames. Inside were ledgers, records of transactions written in Eliza Blackwood's hand. Each entry listed a coded source, a weight, a preservation method, and a price. The description of the goods was always the same: specialty meat. The buyers were traced to cities as far away as Knoxville, Atlanta, and New Orleans. Bank records later confirmed that these transactions matched a series of deposits to Mrs. Blackwood's Hollow Creek account, sums that adjusted for modern value totaled more than $1.5 million. It became clear that the Blackwood estate had not merely been a house of mourning, but the center of a grim and profitable enterprise. The ledgers recovered from beneath the ruins of the Blackwood estate told a story even more horrifying than the cellar itself. Each entry listed coded transactions, with prices rising sharply for what were described as prime cuts or specialty items. Among the notations were client preferences. One entry read, "J.H. prefers younger specimens tender," while another noted Dr. W. requires material suitable for rejuvenation. Preparations pays premium. These chilling details suggested not just a single monstrous act, but a network of buyers with influence, wealth, and disturbing appetites. As investigators combed through the remains of Mrs. Blackwood's correspondence, they discovered letters written in code to contacts across the South, Knoxville, Atlanta, even New Orleans. When deciphered, the letters revealed negotiations over quality, freshness, and characteristics of the goods, with chilling specificity about age and health. The names behind these letters were hidden behind initials and aliases, but investigators determined that at least two belonged to respected physicians, one to a prominent businessman and another to an elected official. The fire had destroyed much, but in what was believed to be Mrs. Blackwood's private study, unknown even to former servants, investigators found fragments of a journal that cast her actions in an even darker light. The surviving pages, now sealed in the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation archives, contained recipes that no human kitchen should ever record, describing the preparation of dishes made from human flesh, accompanied by notes on their supposed sustaining and rejuvenating properties. In her own handwriting, she wrote of feeling stronger, her complexion brighter, her energy unbroken by time. She described a sensation of time standing still. But as the entries continued, her tone shifted. She began to speak of cravings, refined by experience, and flavors only found in select sources. The final legible entry, dated June 7, 1883. 2 days before the fire, simply read, "It is time to relocate operations. Local supplies have drawn unwanted attention." Sheriff Dillard's later investigation into her past revealed that Eliza's history stretched far beyond Hollow Creek. Records from Asheville, North Carolina, showed that before she was Mrs. Blackwood, she was known as Eliza Morton, wife of George Harrington, who died in 1874 of a wasting disease of unknown origin, a vague cause signed off by a physician long deceased. Earlier still, Virginia records revealed a marriage to William Preston, who vanished during a hunting trip in 1868. His rifle and clothing were found near a ravine, and though his body was never recovered, his widow quietly collected his estate and disappeared soon after. The trail led even further back to Charleston, South Carolina, in 1861, where newspaper archives told of a young woman named Eliza Morton, found unconscious beside the partially eaten remains of her own family after a supposed home invasion during the chaos of the Civil War. She was discovered 2 weeks after the incident uninjured and, according to reports, remarkably well-nourished despite the ordeal. The attending physician, in a private letter uncovered a century later, confided that the family's bodies showed signs of post-mortem preparation inconsistent with animal scavenging. Together, these pieces formed a pattern too terrible to ignore. What began as a desperate act of survival during wartime hunger had grown into something else entirely. A belief system built on flesh, a business disguised as mourning, and a woman who turned the act of consumption into both livelihood and obsession. And as for Eliza Blackwood herself, no body was ever found. Some said she perished in the fire. Others whispered that she escaped before the flames took hold, continuing her operations under another name somewhere far beyond the hills of Tennessee. In the years following the fire, reports of a woman resembling Eliza Blackwood surfaced across the country, some as far west as the Oklahoma Territory, others as far north as Chicago. None were ever confirmed, but the consistency of the descriptions was unsettling. A pale, refined woman who appeared much younger than her stated age, often traveling alone and paying in cash. A wanted poster issued in 1884, now preserved in the Tennessee State Museum, described her as approximately 40 years of age, though frequently mistaken for a woman in her 20s, and warned that she may have altered her appearance and manner considerably. The reward for information leading to her capture was $500, a small fortune at the time, and a clear reflection of the horror her crimes had left behind. Officially, the investigation was closed in 1888, with authorities concluding that Mrs. Blackwood had likely perished in the fire or died while attempting to flee. But history rarely ends so neatly. In October 1902, nearly 20 years later, the registry of the Fairchild Hotel in San Francisco recorded the name E. Blackwood, listing a home address simply as Tennessee. That same night, a young kitchen worker at the hotel vanished without a trace. Police records show that the manager filed a report after finding his employees' belongings untouched in his quarters and discovering that the mysterious guest had departed suddenly before questioning. A chambermaid who cleaned the room afterward described odd stains in the bathtub and several small glass jars left behind on the dresser. The report was quietly filed and forgotten for decades until a University of California researcher stumbled upon it in 1967 while studying patterns of unexplained disappearances along the West Coast. The widow's name was never mentioned again in official investigations, but her legend endured in whispers. The land where the Blackwood estate once stood remained untouched for more than 70 years. Its boundaries marked only by overgrown fences and the memories of those who still dared to speak of it. Then in 1955, construction crews clearing ground for a new stretch of highway unearthed something extraordinary. Buried deep beneath what had been the rear garden were large ceramic vessels, at least 20 of them, sealed and arranged in careful rows. The discovery was never officially documented, but the foreman's private journal, later donated to the Tennessee Historical Society by his daughter, described how one jar cracked open during excavation, revealing what he called human remains preserved, like a specimen, not a burial. County officials ordered the containers removed and reburied in an undisclosed location, instructing all workers to remain silent. Rumor has it the new resting place lies somewhere beneath the eastbound lane of Highway 67, just 3 miles outside modern-day Elizabethton. The Blackwood case remains one of the darkest chapters in Tennessee's history. A story where the isolation of mountain life, the limitations of small-town law enforcement, and the social blindness toward a genteel woman of status combine to hide something monstrous in plain sight. It stands as a chilling reminder that the worst horrors in human history are not born of myth or legend, but of people who shed their humanity in pursuit of power, pleasure, or longevity. Even more unsettling are the missing persons reports filed between 1883 and 1905 across cities from Savannah to Philadelphia, each describing individuals last seen with a poised, well-dressed widow who looked far too young for her years. When researchers at Vanderbilt University compiled these accounts in 1967, they noted a pattern that spanned decades and hundreds of miles. A predator moving with patience and precision, always one step ahead of those who would uncover her truth. The researcher who uncovered the trail of disappearances linked to Eliza Blackwood never lived to publish his findings. During an archive reorganization in 1968, his collection of notes and documents vanished, reportedly misfiled or destroyed. The only surviving artifact was a single photograph discovered among his belongings after his death in 1969. The image, dated 1904, was taken in Atlantic City. It shows a woman elegant and expensively dressed, estimated to be in her 60s, though claiming to be celebrating her 80th birthday. Her face is partly shadowed by a parasol, but what can be seen is striking smooth skin, a youthful glow, and eyes that seem to stare directly, almost knowingly, into the lens. On the back, written in neat old-fashioned script, were the words, "E, still hungry after all these years." In Hollow Creek, now absorbed into the larger town of Elizabethton, the legend of the widow endures. Locals still claim the land where the Blackwood estate once stood carries a kind of residual unease, not a curse of spirits, but of memory. Hunters avoid the area, describing an unnatural stillness, a silence that feels watchful. Hikers report an instinctive urge to turn back, saying it feels as though the woods themselves are holding their breath. Even animals seem to keep their distance. A 1952 geological survey may explain part of the phenomenon. Soil samples from the site contained chemical traces consistent with 19th century preservation compounds, likely the remnants of the widow's experiments. The contamination, invisible but enduring, may have altered the ecosystem and even affected human perception, giving rise to the eerie atmosphere that persists to this day. The story of Eliza Blackwood continues to captivate because it touches on something primal. A fear that those we trust, those meant to nurture and protect, might see us instead as commodities, resources, or nourishment. In her time when travel outpaced communication and strangers often moved unnoticed through isolated settlements, she thrived in the perfect void between civilization and wilderness. What remains unclear is whether she was born a monster or shaped into one by circumstance. The account from Charleston in 1861 hints at a moment of transformation, perhaps a desperate act of survival that awakened something darker, something that grew more deliberate with time. Her later actions, meticulous and commercialized, suggest not madness but method, a belief system built around consumption as preservation. The body is both sustenance and currency. A century later, faint echoes of that belief appeared again in the writings of Dr. William Harrison, an ethnographer who documented Appalachian folk traditions in the 1920s. Among charms, tinctures, and superstitions, he noted a disturbing whisper of a practice believed to draw vitality from the dead through selective consumption of flesh. It was said to grant youth, strength, and endurance, an old-world superstition surviving in isolated mountain pockets. Harrison wrote that whenever he brought up the topic, his informants grew silent. One who had previously been eager to share stories became hostile, warning him to leave the matter alone. Harrison's final note on the subject was brief and chilling. I shall not pursue these inquiries further. This morning I found a butcher's knife laid upon my doorstep, the blade positioned to catch the rising sun. Whether coincidence, folklore, or evidence of something darker still at work, the legend of the widow endures a haunting intersection of hunger, vanity, and the human capacity to rationalize even the most unthinkable acts. It's impossible to read the final chapters of the Blackwood case without feeling that someone somewhere still wanted its secrets buried. The intimidation faced by Dr. Harrison and the disappearance of research materials decades later suggests that the legacy of the widow may have reached far beyond Hollow Creek, that perhaps some of her clients or their descendants still had reason to fear exposure. That possibility gained a grim new weight in 1963, when workmen renovating an old commercial building in downtown Atlanta uncovered a sealed room behind a false wall. Inside were boxes of decayed business records, ledgers, and correspondence dating back to the 1880s. Among the papers, investigators found a single letter, dated March 1883, addressed simply to Mrs. E., at a Tennessee post office box. The letter, written by someone who identified himself only as a satisfied customer, thanked her for the remarkable restorative properties of your special provision and requested another larger order, sourced from similarly robust stock. It went on to describe the writer's transformation. Improved complexion, renewed energy, sharper mind, what his personal physician had called a miraculous recovery. I attribute this entirely to your expertise, the letter read, and will pay handsomely for continued access to your singular products. The letter erased any doubt that Eliza Blackwood had not acted alone. She had clientele, wealthy, educated, well-connected people who knew exactly what they were purchasing. Their money had fueled her operations, their silence had protected her, and their vanity had justified everything. Whether for supposed medical rejuvenation, forbidden thrill, or perverse indulgence, they were willing participants in her crimes. The trail went cold again until 1968, when a frail woman calling herself Eleanor Bradford was admitted to a private sanitarium near Boston, suffering from what doctors described as nutritional dementia. She spoke of maintaining her youth through special meats and claimed she had once been celebrated for her vitality. Despite her advanced age, she said she was 90, though she looked barely 65. The admitting physician's notes mention unusual dental wear, consistent with an abnormal protein-heavy diet. After 3 weeks, the woman died quietly in her sleep. Her body was cremated at the request of an attorney who appeared with perfect paperwork but refused to answer questions. No family came forward. Among her few belongings was a small leather-bound journal filled with recipes and personal reflections. The sanitarium's administrator turned it over to authorities, but its contents were never published. A nurse who saw it briefly described pages detailing the preparation of human tissue, with notations about the effects derived from various sources. Details chillingly similar to those in the fragments of Mrs. Blackwood's original journal. Was Eleanor Bradford, the final identity of Eliza Blackwood. The sanitarium's files were redacted before being archived, erasing nearly every identifying detail. Officially, no link was ever proven. Yet the resemblance, the habits, and the obsession with special meat remain impossible to ignore. The story of the widow of Hollow Creek endures as a distinctly American horror, one not born of folklore, but of human desire and decay. It grew from the isolation of the Tennessee hills, fed on the desperation of post-war survival, and flourishing through the greed of those who mistook consumption for renewal. The hills themselves have seen every kind of tragedy: displacement, violence, starvation, but nothing as intimate or methodical as what took place within the walls of the Blackwood estate. Eliza Blackwood turned necessity into craft, grief into industry, and flesh into profit. Her crimes were not acts of madness, but of meticulous purpose, carried out with the same precision as curing ham or canning preserves. Today there are no plaques, no historical markers, not even a warning sign on the road that cuts through the old property. The story survives only in scattered archives, buried letters, and the uneasy silence of the locals who still avoid that stretch of forest. It lingers because it speaks to something that has never disappeared, the hunger of those who consume others not out of need, but out of power. As the sun dips behind the Tennessee hills, consider this. Eliza Blackwood's methods, isolating the vulnerable, earning their trust, harvesting what she needed, and selling the results to those insulated by wealth, were not unique to her century. They are the same predatory patterns that thrive in different forms today. The instruments have changed, but the instinct remains. Some monsters feed on flesh. Others feed on opportunity, trust, or fear. And like the widow of Hollow Creek, they endure precisely because we prefer to believe such hunger could never live behind a human face. And perhaps even now in some climate-controlled archive tucked deep in the stacks of a university or museum basement, there rests a small leather-bound journal labeled Property of Eleanor Bradford, its brittle pages filled with recipes refined over decades. Somewhere waiting for an eager researcher or collector to rediscover it lies the written legacy of a woman who viewed humanity not as a fellowship of equals, but as an endless supply of raw material. That more than any single act of violence is the true horror of the widow Blackwood. The realization that her methods required no supernatural power, only opportunity, intellect, and appetite. Her work could so easily be repeated by those who share her hunger. Our own modern predators dressed in respectability, exploiting others not for survival, but for pleasure and profit. So the next time you stop at a roadside inn, or a small-town diner in the Tennessee hills, as the evening fog settles and the scent of home-cooked food drifts from the kitchen, take a moment to think. That special family recipe passed down for generations, how much do you really know about its origins? The widow's customers never asked. They simply enjoyed their rejuvenation and ordered more. In 1965, new evidence surfaced hundreds of miles away. Restoration workers in an antebellum home in Savannah, Georgia, discovered a hidden compartment beneath the kitchen floor. Inside lay a small leather book, its cover cracked, but its ink perfectly preserved. Though unsigned, its contents mirrored the surviving fragments of Blackwood's own recipe journal, only this version was complete. It detailed precise preparation techniques and philosophical reflections on what the unknown author called the ultimate sustainability. One passage read, "The flesh that once housed a spirit now departed may continue to serve by transferring its essence to those who appreciate its value. In consuming, we honor. In honoring, we preserve something that might otherwise be lost to the earth." Property records revealed that the home's owner, in 1886, was a Mrs. Elizabeth Blackett, a widow of refined taste and independent means who had relocated from points west. Local newspapers remembered her as an elegant hostess whose dinner parties were envied across Savannah society, her dishes described as unlike anything tasted before, invigorating and unforgettable. But in 1897, Mrs. Blackett disappeared, coinciding with police investigations into missing servants and transient laborers in the city. Her home was found abandoned, dinner service still laid on the table. The evidence suggested that Eliza Blackwood had not only escaped justice, but had evolved, moving from frontier solitude to urban sophistication. Her methods unchanged, her victims newly anonymous. That pattern reappeared again 3 decades later. In 1968, a University of Pennsylvania researcher uncovered the financial ledgers of a private Philadelphia social club active between 1898 and 1904, known as the Rejuvenation Society, ostensibly a gathering of doctors and industrialists devoted to modern science and longevity. Its records listed regular payments to a Madame Elise for dietary supplements and proprietary preparations. The prices, astronomical even for the wealthy, were accompanied by chilling correspondence. Consume within 3 days for maximum efficacy. The match between source and recipient is vital. The young renew the young. The trail abruptly ended in November 1904 when Philadelphia police began investigating the disappearance of several immigrant workers last seen near Madame Elise's residence. When authorities arrived, the apartment was empty, its air thick with an acrid chemical odor. Neighbors spoke of strange sounds, metallic clattering, rhythmic pounding in the nights before she vanished. From there, the widow's path dissolved into rumor. A hotel register in Chicago, 1906, records an E.B. Morton who stayed 3 weeks. During that time, 2 hotel maids went missing. In 1912, a Boston boarding house briefly run by a Mrs. Elizabeth Blackstone gained local attention for its owner's oddly youthful face and her habit of inviting select lodgers to private dinners. Each time she disappeared before questions could be asked. And then silence, until medical archives uncovered patient notes from early plastic surgery pioneers describing a mysterious female benefactor who supplied organic materials for experimental rejuvenation treatments. No name was given, only the initials, E.B., and the notation. Age indeterminate. Appearance remarkable. Source private. Perhaps she died under one of those names. Perhaps she simply moved again, leaving behind another mask and another legend. Or perhaps her legacy endures hidden in our culture's obsession with youth and the industries built around it. The story of Eliza Blackwood is more than a relic of 19th century horror. It is a mirror reflecting what happens when the hunger for longevity and beauty outweighs the sanctity of human life. The widow's knives may have rusted long ago, but the world she imagined, a world where people are consumed for what they can provide, remains very much alive. A private medical clinic in New York, operating quietly between 1915 and 1924, maintained a roster of elite patients seeking experimental rejuvenation treatments. Among them was a woman identified only as Patient E.B., who underwent a series of procedures described as facial rejuvenation and identity concealment. The surgeon's surviving notes are clinical but revealing. He described his patient as physiologically exceptional, appearing to be in her 60s, yet displaying the vascular elasticity and tissue vitality of someone at least 30 years younger. He attributed her condition to genetic fortune, apparently unaware of the darker truth behind her longevity. If this E.B. was indeed Eliza Blackwood, she would have been well into her 70s, yet by every account she remained strikingly youthful, composed, and strong. The implication is difficult to dismiss. Her gruesome dietary regimen may have produced tangible biological effects, reinforcing her belief that consuming human flesh sustained her life and beauty. The last verifiable thread in the Blackwood timeline returns to the 1968 sanitarium records, describing Eleanor Bradford, the elderly woman who still insisted on her special meat. If this was truly Eliza, she had survived to at least 105 years of age, maintaining the appearance of someone decades younger until the final weeks of her life. Her physical decline, according to the attending physician, began only after she could no longer access her chosen diet. The staff noted disturbing incidents during her brief confinement. She was twice caught attempting to take tissue samples from sedated patients in neighboring rooms. They dismissed it as delusion brought on by dementia. But in light of her potential identity, it suggests something far more horrifying, a compulsion so deeply etched into her being that it persisted long after reason had faded. Taken together, the fragmented trail of documents, letters, and sightings paints a staggering portrait, if we accept that. Eliza Morton Blackwood lived under aliases such as Elizabeth Blackett, Madame Elise, Elizabeth Blackstone, and finally, Eleanor Bradford. Then we are looking at a predator who operated for over a century. From the 1860s to the late 1960s, she hunted and supplied, adapting her name, her appearance, and her methods as America itself transformed around her. She bridged the gap between eras, the frontier and the modern world, preying on the anonymous and feeding the powerful. Her story forces a grim re-evaluation of history. Serial predation is not a phenomenon of the modern age. It has always existed, shrouded by distance, poor communication, and a society unwilling to believe what a human being, especially a woman, might be capable of. The deeper horror lies in the suggestion that she was not alone. The recovered correspondence makes clear that her clients were not deceived. They were participants. Educated men of medicine, business, and politics rationalized their indulgence as a form of medical progress, a scientific pursuit of youth and vitality. They were not victims of manipulation. They were customers of convenience. Their wealth insulated them, their influence erased evidence, and their reputations depended on silence. The disappearance of records, the destruction of documents, and the reluctance of officials to act all point to a quiet conspiracy, a tacit agreement among the powerful to bury the truth of what they had consumed. Back in Tennessee, the land where the Blackwood estate once stood remains empty. Local developers have purchased and abandoned it more than once. The last serious attempt came in 1962, when plans for a new housing subdivision fell apart after 3 workers reported identical nightmares of a well-dressed woman inviting them to dinner. They quit the job the next morning. Skeptics call it superstition, yet the unease lingers. Psychologists describe it as cultural memory, the way trauma imprints itself on a place passed down through generations as instinct and story. Hollow Creek may have vanished from maps absorbed into Elizabethton, but its silence still holds weight. The trees seem to grow a little denser there, the air feels a little heavier, and the locals still hesitate to linger after dark. The case of the widow Blackwood endures not merely as a tale of horror, but as a warning. She did not haunt through curses or ghosts, but through her understanding of humanity's oldest appetite. The hunger for more beauty, more life, more youth, more power. In her hands, survival became commerce, and consumption became belief. And while the woman herself may finally be gone, her lesson remains chillingly relevant. Civilization has always disguised predation beneath refinement. Some monsters do not die. They adapt trading cleavers for contracts, sellers for boardrooms, and flesh for whatever currency the age demands. For those who study the psychology of evil, the case of Eliza Blackwood remains one of the most unsettling examples of how predation can be refined into enterprise. Her transformation from desperate survivor to calculated killer to purveyor of luxury flesh followed a perverse but coherent logic. She recognized a demand among the wealthy for youth, vitality, and beauty, and supplied what she believed was an effective means to attain them. In her mind, she was not merely committing murder, she was conducting business. Her operation, as grotesque as it was, functioned within a framework of supply and demand, a marketplace of vanity, greed, and fear of decay. In that sense, the widow was not a creature of pure madness, but of market instinct. Her products were branded with the same language modern advertisers still use. Premium sources, select cuts, superior quality. Her clientele were not innocent dupes, but willing consumers who cloaked their appetites in medical pretense. What she sold was horror repackaged as refinement indulgence disguised as healing. And while her methods seem unthinkable today, the impulse behind them is disturbingly familiar. In a world where human labor, body parts, and even genetic material can be commodified, her crimes stand as a literal enactment of a metaphor that society continues to live by consuming others for personal gain. Eliza Blackwood's story forces an uncomfortable question. Was she an anomaly, or simply an unmasked reflection of the same transactional cruelty that still drives human ambition? Her success depended on three conditions that remain timeless: the vulnerability of victims, the wealth of clients, and the silence of those who profit from looking away. The cannibalism she practiced may have been physical, but the metaphorical consumption she embodied of people as resources, of lives as currency, still thrives beneath the polished veneer of modern commerce. Despite decades of research, the full extent of her operations remains obscured. How many vanished into her provisions? How vast was the network of those who paid to partake? Every new fragment letters, ledgers stray. Medical notes suggests a scale larger than anyone dared imagine. But much of the truth has been lost, buried beneath official indifference, destroyed to protect reputations, or simply eroded by time. What endures are traces, the faint odor of chemicals in the soil where her estate once stood, the unease that still haunts the forest, and the cold drafts locals claim to feel when they pass too near. There are no monuments to her victims, no plaques warning of what happened in those hills. Only silence and the uneasy sense that some stains never fully fade. Travelers still say that the woods grow oddly still near the old property line, that birds avoid the trees there, and that the air sometimes carries a faint sweetness like meat cured too long. Perhaps it's nothing more than the power of suggestion, or perhaps, as folklore insists, certain hungers leave traces that never quite dissipate. The widow of Hollow Creek remains more than a historical curiosity. She is a parable about what happens when human desire, unchecked by empathy or conscience, turns others into commodities. She stands as proof that evil need not roar or brandish weapons. Sometimes it simply sets the table. So when you find yourself in a quiet southern town, dining on a recipe that's been in the family for generations, you might do well to wonder where that recipe began. Ask perhaps about its history. And if the host's smile lingers too long, or if their eyes glint with something more than hospitality, you might think twice before accepting that second helping. After all, the widow's customers never questioned the source of their rejuvenation. They simply savored it and asked for more.